This is the Kyle Bettleyon utility knife. I picked this up from Kyle maybe about a month ago. Had a sale vid. Had a great price on this knife. And I wanted it because I wanted to support Kyle, and also I just like M4 steel, which this is made out of, and it just looked like a really solid knife. When I got it, I was very pleasantly surprised at the knife. Just to go over a few specs: M4 blade steel, about 63 Rockwell, a modified Warncliffe blade, at least that's what I would call it. JG10 handle, I would say roughly 1/8 inch or so stock, very slight taper to the blade, and roughly 10 or so thou behind the edge. I've just been using this as a general utility knife for the last month, cutting anything I could find around the house. Using it quite a bit in the kitchen, which I was pleasantly surprised at this finish, that it's holding up and not rusting too dearly. Done quite a bit of wood cutting. I've done, I would say, somewhere around 1,000 cuts into cardboard. Not a huge amount. I could definitely do some more. And I'm considering actually buying some manila rope. Stuff's not something I have a lot of access to, and it's kind of expensive, and I like to buy a lot of knives. So I'm thinking about doing that to do a run. But I have to say, this is one of the most enjoyable what's the word I'm looking for? Examples, sorry, of this steel that I've played with in a very long time. I have a Gail Bradley. I've had a Benchmade Contigo. I currently have an M4 710 from Benchmade, and I've played with a few more M4 knives. This is a very nice job. Very nice hardness. Peters did a fantastic job on this heat treat. Ergonomics on this knife are very nice. Kyle has done a very good job of rounding all the contact areas of the handle, so there's no really sharp spots. Even up here where you'll often see a sharp edge, there's pretty much nothing sharp on the spine. Although the spine isn't particularly rounded, he did break the edges very nicely, so there's not a lot of irritation. Sharpening choil. I personally prefer sharpening choils. I know some people don't like them because these can catch in cutting, especially any type of soft material, cardboard, ropes, things like that. If you try to start bringing it back really to the rear of the edge, you can catch it, and I've done that. But to me, that's not a really big issue with the design per se. That's just you needing more control, and it's not something that I have an issue with. What can I say about the grip? It's a really nice multifunctional grip. It has this sort of exaggerated finger choil that kind of forms a guard right here, so it's harder for you to slide up on the edge. Not saying you absolutely can't, but it would be you'd have to be thrusting into something with a fair decent bit of force in order to force your hand up onto the edge of the knife. This jimping that Kyle has done is kind of cool. It's somewhat different than what I'm used to. It's kind of that very large style of jimping, but on the flats, he's got a filed texture, which is quite fine. So it gives you a nice spot of indexing to let you know where your thumb would be, but when you put some pressure, it will hold your thumb. Not overly aggressive. And I'm not positive yet if I still would take this over, say, Spyderco's jimping, that very fine, close together jimping. To me, that is an excellent example of jimping. Works fantastically, but I'm liking this. The knife fits well in a hammer grip. This is how I did the wood cutting with this sort of grip. It worked well. This finger choil I thought was going to be an issue, but the handle has enough width, and I've got enough room down here that I can get a really good grip with the bottom 3 fingers, and this just kind of comes around, and it's there, and this supports the inside of my palm where I'm applying most of my force, and so any kind of cutting, pushing down like that, works fine. I also have held it like this for a chest lever grip where you're using your back muscles to cut. Really powerful form of cutting because you're using much larger muscles than just your arm. Pretty comfortable. Didn't have any hot spots. Then again, I didn't do an especially large amount of cutting with that grip, but it did work fine for what I did. I haven't done anything like this. Again, like I've said before, I don't see the serious practical value of this. This is, to me, a fighting grip. So if you're concerned with fighting, that's fine, but for this type of knife as a utility knife, not really a valid grip. Same thing for this. I don't know what you would do. I suppose maybe if you were doing like sods or something, this could be a grip because the type of cutting you're doing, you're putting the blade into the ground and you would draw it back to you using your back muscles again, a larger muscle group. I haven't done any of that. I mean, I'm in Louisiana. I don't know that we would even be able to do sods as wet as it is down here. But I suppose it would work okay for that. Pinch grip, which is how I use it in the kitchen, works fine. No issues whatsoever with that. Very nice ergonomics. I suppose if I had to make one change to it, I would lighten up this choil a little bit. Because for the way that I use this knife, this choil, for me personally, is just not necessary for it to be that big. I would probably not make it so long and not make it so deep. But then again, that's a personal thing. It's not because of there's any really bad effects on use with this choil. It works fine, but it's just if I was being nitpicky, I would do that. The blade actually has a bit of sweep to it, so if you put the handle straight like that, you can see the blade has a little bit of arc upwards, so you can get some pretty nice slicing cuts with this knife. And I've peeled numerous types of foods. I don't typically like to peel potatoes. I did it just to try it. It worked okay. I would say this back part is a little wide for that. If this was just a true pure paring knife, I would thin out this section, but being that this is a jack-of-all-trades utility knife, I quite like it. Also, one thing I like about these modified Warncliffes as a utility knife is that, like I was saying, it gives you the ability to have a sweep to the edge, a gentle sweep, not a radical one, and still maintain easily accessible tip for any sort of fine tip work you may need to do, some scoring, or something like that. Very nice blade shape in my experience, in my use for this. Really like it. Again, 10th thou behind the edge. Really, really nice and thin. Especially compared to most production knives, people would say this is... I guess I've heard people refer to 10th thou behind the edge as radically thin. I would vehemently disagree with you. This is a similar geometry to what Phil Wilson will often use. And I've done some batoning with this knife. Not even a hint of a turned edge. No edge damage. I've done ramming cuts into knots with this knife. No visible damage. I can only feel slight amount of damage from that use on cutting fine papers and things like that. But zero edge stability problems with this knife at this very nice thin geometry. And this is a knife I would probably in the future bring out anytime I start having conversations with people about blade and edge geometries. And they start telling me that 10th thou behind the edge and 10 degrees per side, which is the edge angle on this, is too low. Because this is M4, and granted, for high carbide steels, M4 actually does have pretty good edge stability and pretty good toughness. But in an absolute sense, looking at steels that have high edge stability and high toughness, M4 is not one of them overall. You take stuff like AEBL, 1084, 1095, A201, 52100, etc. at a similar hardness to this, and this steel very quickly then starts to look brittle. You know, M4's oddly gotten this weird reputation for toughness, and not to say, I wouldn't certainly say this steel was brittle, even in an absolute sense. I wouldn't call it a brittle steel. But people have this weird fascination with M4, especially because of the cutting competitions and blade sports, people using M4, and it gives people this idea that it's this radically tough steel, and it really isn't. Again, like I was saying, not brittle, but certainly not what I would call, or what I would go to for a tough steel. And the reason people, I would argue, get that misconception is they see these big, huge choppers used in these cutting competitions by guys like Dale Bradley and stuff like that, and admittedly, they make a damn fine knife. Those cutting competition choppers work very well for what they're designed to. Competition chopping by knife users who are very well versed in how to use a knife properly and how to maximize the effects of that knife on the material they're being cut. Those big M4 choppers are not as hard as this. They're typically 59 to 60. They're also ground fairly thin, but they're not doing actually any particularly strenuous cutting. They're cutting a 2x4, they're cutting a little bit of pipe, they're cutting some rope, they're cutting a little bit of foam, they're cutting a tennis ball that drops down, they're cutting some free hanging rope, and stuff like that. And if you look at the actual course of cutting, that's not a strenuous set of cutting. They're not batoning anything, they're not, you know, hitting knots in any of that. And so it gives people this deceptive idea that M4 has a lot of toughness, and it really doesn't. And so this, even still with those properties, at this edge and edge geometry, this is really one of those knives that I'm going to point to in the future when people talk about what the amount of material you need behind an edge to have a tough knife. Because we have really, I think, lost sight of a practical view on toughness. You know, I'm not going to argue that, you know, if you took this knife and made it 30 or 40 thousandths behind the edge, you wouldn't have a stronger edge. You absolutely would. That's just physics. You can't argue that, really. But what have you really gained from that added toughness versus what have you lost in cutting ability? Yeah, this is a small knife. This knife's maybe, I'd say, 4 inches long in the blade. Maybe 8 inches, 7 or 8 inches overall length, maybe 9, something like that. There's only so much you can expect from a knife like this. And so when you see knives like this in the industry that are beefed up to, you know, 30 thou behind the edge like that, it just doesn't make sense. And that's one of the things I really like about Kyle's knives, is that he is one of these knife makers that come out and say, no, you don't need this huge amount of material behind the edge. Learn how to use a knife appropriately, and you can make these thin edge work for you and have a much better and efficient cutting knife. And so, in the end, this is just a really nice functional utility piece. I use it for just, so far, any type of cutting I've had for the last month, and it's done very, very well. If you guys want to check out Kyle's work, he's on IG as KWB Blades, and he's got his contact info. He makes a really, really solid knife. Really cool guy to talk to. I've been talking to him for the last month. Very nice guy. Young guy. I've only been making knives about 1.5 years, but already he does a really solid job. Anyway, y'all, if you guys have any questions or comments or anything, please put them down below. I'll try to get back to them. Thanks for watching.